it's okay to lie to the police. So my focus isn't so much on did she know it was a lie, it was the way in which Mr. McIver was interacting with Ms. Carter. And I believe that it would not be irrational for a juror to conclude that Mr. McIver was attempting to mislead Ms. Carter into accepting the proposition that it would be okay to lie to the police. She said, I didn't find that it was okay, and so I didn't lie to the police. But that doesn't mean Mr. McIver didn't attempt it. And as we all agreed yesterday under 16-4-3, an attempt is a lesser included is the right phrase, but it is read into any allegation and indictment that the actual offense was committed. That's what 16-4-3 says on its face, and that's also how it works as applied. And I'm relying on the case of Judice, Judice versus State at 308 Georgia Appeals 229. It says what I just said about how 16-4-3 works. I'll need to amend the jury charge a little bit if after the state rests, after the defense rests, count 5 persists, but assuming that count 5 persists till deliberations, I'll need to add some language about attempt and how attempt is always a lesser included. Count 6, I disagree with the state's analysis of Mr. Crane's testimony that he was ever asked or pressured by Mr. McIver to retract the bump piece. I thought that's what we would hear. I was told that's what we would hear, but I don't think that's what Mr. Crane said. Regardless of my analysis about whether bump was in there, which is really the only, I think, germane piece to what an investigation might be. Mr. McIver has said in various formats, I was scared because of how the people looked, because they were homeless, because maybe it was Black Lives Matter. They are all creatures of, he didn't like the neighborhood he was in. He didn't think it was safe for him, for his wife, for Miss Carter. Please give me the gun. And that's been consistent throughout, whether it's, there were a lot of people, a few people, they were carjackers, they were homeless, they were milling, they weren't milling, they were approaching the car. The Black Lives Matter piece, I don't think is something retracted or not retracted to law enforcement would have affected the investigation, affect media coverage, but not the investigation. But the deeper and more critical point is none of this was to law enforcement. And I roundly reject the notion that an effort by a defendant to mislead or threaten, and we don't have threats here, but any of the ways you could commit a violation of 16-1093 in an effort to get that person to withhold information from the media is a crime. It's not. It's not what the statute says, and it doesn't work to try to stretch out. Well, if it gets in a newspaper, I'm a judge, I'm going to read it. Don't read articles about those kinds of cases, but a judge might. DA might read the daily report, and law enforcement might follow the AGC. That's all true, but I am confident that that law enforcement, I hope that law enforcement, the DA's office, and judges aren't basing much of their decisions about what to charge and what not, because a defendant or an attorney for a defendant or a spokesperson for a defendant who can afford a spokesperson says, this is a witch hunt. Is it really a witch hunt just because someone says that to the media? I don't think that's how law enforcement typically reacts. So I'm granting the motion as to count 6 because it was not an effort, attempted or otherwise, by Mr. McIver to influence Mr. Crane to withhold information from any of the three of the triumvirate. Count 7 fails for the same reason and an additional reason, meaning I grant the motion as to count 7. First, as with count 6, what Mr. McIver was trying to do with the voicemail that he actually left with Mr. Carter, but I accept the state's reasoning that it was really an effort to influence Ms. Carter, not her husband, what it actually said in the voicemail. The effort was to contrary to how it was characterized in the bond hearing and before trial started, what the testimony makes clear from Ms. Carter, Mr. Carter, I don't know about Dale Cardwell, but at least the Carters, is that these calls were all about that limo that was there to get Ms. Carter not to go meet with Detective Smith or Mr. Rucker or the judge, but with Mr. Maples, who would be at the time Mr. McIver's attorney, and maybe a court reporter and a videographer, and maybe some reporter, or to explain how an effort to get someone to talk or not talk to the media is not reached by 161093. It similarly doesn't reach efforts to get a witness to talk or not talk to one's own attorney or a court reporter or something like that. But that's also not what the state charged, and that's the other reason why I think count 7 fails, and I'm granting the motion. Even though the state's response received this morning talks about this was all an effort to influence Ms. Carter, what count 7 says is that the defendant implied in his voicemail that Ms. Carter, now I quote, ceased communicating her recollection of the facts and circumstances of the death of Landa Diane McIver to law enforcement officers. And I don't think there's a conflict in the testimony such that count 7 survives the motion for directed verdict, that in fact what Mr. McIver was trying to do, as Mr. Samuel said rather animatedly yesterday, he was trying to get her to talk, not the law enforcement, but to get her to talk to Mr. Maples, the court reporter, etc. It didn't have anything to do with law enforcement directly. I agree with the state that there are indirect consequences to everything Mr. McIver was doing to Crane and what he was doing to Mr. and Ms. Carter. Indirect consequences for an investigation, for law enforcement, for the DA's office, all of which the jury is privy to, and appropriately so. But it's not the kind of conduct that is reached, criminalized by 161093. That doesn't mean that those were easy voicemails for the Carters to receive. They were easy conversations for Mr. Crane to endure. It means that they weren't actions or attempts by Mr. McIver that are prohibited by 161093. So to recap, count 5 survives the motion for directed verdict. Count 6 and 7 do not. Mr. Samuel, anything you want to get on the record in light of that ruling?
There's something I want on the record I want to digest a bit, and not much, but the ruling, and maybe at the end of the day I may have some observations which may inform the jury instruction issue, and maybe 1 or 2 other items that I want to get counsel from my counsel.
Sure. Fair enough. Mr. Abate and anyone else from the team, but you have been the primary voice for the motion for directed verdict.
Nothing at this time.
Okay.
Just to make sure, Judge, I understand the court's ruling. It does not, your ruling with respect to 6 and 7 do not prohibit the state from arguing that evidence.
As consciousness of guilt or anything you might want to do, but as my ruling stands now, and Mr. Samuel may tell me something that causes me to revisit, and I changed my mind about count 6 and 7. I don't think that's the focus of his comments that you made. But as it stands right now, you wouldn't be arguing that you've proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. McIver is guilty of count 6 and 7 because they wouldn't be in front of the jury.
That's correct.
But we had a very robust discussion before trial started about severance and all that, and I opined then, and I maintain that opinion, that in the same way that Mr. Dickerson's testimony is relevant, inextricably intertwined, consciousness of guilt, pick your bases, that would apply to 5, 6, and 7.
Okay.
5 remains in the case right now, so you'd be free to argue it either way. It's proof of these other things, and by the way, we prove count 5. But the evidence that you have produced in support of those counts, I continue to believe is relevant to things you may choose to convince the jury of during closing. That being said, I'm digesting all this as well, and so when we revisit this, it may be that Mr. Samuel points to aspect X of Mr. Carter's testimony.
Sure.
And I reflect on it and say, you know what, that's right, the only basis that could have come in would be in support of count 7 and no other reason. So don't talk about that in your closing. But right now, generically, I think that the evidence that the state introduced in support of those 3 counts, while perhaps not sufficient to allow 6 and 7 to continue, is nonetheless relevant to other things you'd want to appropriately argue in closing.
Understand.
Fair question. All right. Anything else from the defense before we get Dr. Rye back on?
About what I talked
Yes,
about
the
before.
emails, the Arcilla emails. Did we determine if the Arcilla emails were part of the record when Mr. Driscoll was testifying?
Yes, Judge, we did determine that, and they were not part of the record. And I have the PowerPoint here that was displayed for the jury by Mr. Driscoll, and I will refer to the record, page 23. And I think the discussion that Ms. Clark-Palmer made reference to before the lunch break, the court allowed Mr. Driscoll to talk about how the contents of the email informed his opinion. He was not allowed to talk about what the email said. And so I think it was with that proviso that the court said, okay, because he's an expert, he could consider, and I'll allow him to testify about that. And we went further because I think we actually, I don't know if we showed it to you outside the presence of the jury, but I do know that in what was displayed to the jury, there is no quotes, there are no like content, no language or anything like that about the contents of the email.
Yeah, I'm remembering now that you may even have been prohibited, or you may have just backed off from displaying. I don't remember if you had covered it up with paper, or there were pages in the PowerPoint you skipped. I may be misremembering all this, but really what's germane to me is there anything that you and Ms. Clark-Palmer discussing this were pointed to? You were pointed to, look, that's text from an email that was up there, and so things ought to be similar for Dr. Wright. I'm hearing you say, to the contrary, you felt that the ruling was that you were limited, Driscoll was limited, saying, I did review some emails that did inform the conclusion I reached about the valuation of the 10% or whatever it was he was talking about.
Right, that's correct. The quote that was displayed to the jury was the quote from the letter that was already in evidence.
Which we've seen a lot of.
And with the rest of the email, PowerPoint, the information from Arcilla came from documents that were introduced by way of certification of a business record. So the only thing with respect to the email was the email from Stephen Swenson to Mackenzie Davenport. And so that would be my response.
Well, but you're leaving me hanging on that, meaning that particular email was, content of it was included?
No.
There was reference to
just a reference to it.
Okay.
Just reference to it.
All right. Ms. Clark-Palmer, what's your spin on that? I don't have the PowerPoint in front of me, but I'm sure you do, and I don't need to see it. I'm not doubting what Mr. Rucker said, but it could be interpreted differently.
On page 23, it does talk about an email, November 15, 2016, from people who are not Mr. McIver, reference an email to a promissory note in amount of $400,664 payable from T.S. Smith Development Company to Arcilla Resources. And then on page 24, January 17, 2017, an email from Mackenzie Davenport to Mr. McIver providing a value of $6.3 million for Arcilla Mining and Marine Company, LLC, and Arcilla Trucking Company, LLC. Those are the two references to the emails that are in the PowerPoint that are not in evidence.
Okay. And your recollection is that you objected to the text on those two slides as hearsay.
Correct.
Okay. And you further recall that the way I handled that was to say, if it's something the expert relied upon in forming his opinion, then it's something that can be shared, or I overruled it, or I didn't say anything, and people just kept going forward, or, because again, what I said before the break is I'd like to be consistent, assuming I was right the first time. No guarantee of the latter. We'll try to be consistent.
I think my objection was my memory of my objection was definitely overruled. I don't remember what you said as to the basis for overruling it.
How many other nuggets are you trying to mine from the Mayo records to ask Dr. Rye about?
None. I want to ask him, I think it would be two questions. Did you see in the Mayo records, or maybe even one, did you see in the Mayo records references to complaints by Mr. McIver's bed partner that he was physically acting out his dreams?
Okay.
The answer to that would be yes.
Okay. Do you have the Mayo health records?
Yes, I could ask for a specific quote, but I was anticipating it would be better to leave it generic. But for example,
We don't need a specific quote. I'm just
Okay.
curious, because if you've got the records,
Yes.
the only reason why the records aren't in is because you weren't able to get because they're old and it was hard to get a certification.
oh, I think we got a certification.
Okay.
We have, I know we have a certification. The question in my mind was if I gave that. I know I gave the state the Mayo records.
Okay. Okay. I will allow you to ask the question if it is sort of one step back, not specifically what's in the records, but do you recall there being reference to what you just described?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Anything else before we get Dr. Ryan from the defense?
So we have another witness who may come up later this afternoon and may need to deal with a sequestration issue again.
Who would that witness be?
Stan Smith, and we might get to the afternoon break before we call him, but
Sure. But the issue being he's followed the trial?
he has seen some testimony. I wouldn't say followed the trial.
Oh, okay, but he's been exposed, he has exposed himself to coverage. It sounds bad on the record, but he's been watching about the trial.
He has seen some parts of it, and I shared with the state what Mr. Smith related to me that he had seen.
Why, this is an attorney for the estate,
Yes.
whatever was going on, how would he think that was okay?
I don't know how, I can't answer that question. I will say that I sent him a subpoena before trial. I did not specifically instruct him not to watch the trial. The part of the trial he watched was relative, it was Mrs. Carter's testimony, part of that. And then he also said his wife read him some information from the news articles about the details of the shooting, and that's what he told me he has seen. So I failed to instruct him not to watch the coverage. What I don't know is when I reached back out to him and said, okay, we are going to call you, here's when I think it will be. But in any event, I
Okay,
didn't
well, we
instruct
need
him
to
not
find
to
out
watch it.
what it is and
Yeah.
if that's a problem, the
Yeah.
parts that he recalls having followed.
Yeah.
Okay, but thank you for flagging that.
Yes.
Mr. Abate, anything else from the state before we get Dr. Rye back on the stage?
Just, I guess, for some clarification, is your ruling about what can be said about what's in the Mayo records? I believe her question that she relayed to Your Honor was somewhere along the lines of, I guess she said, or the records say that he was acting out his dreams.
So what I understood, I should be clearer. What I think triggered all this was an inquiry into, was there any reference in the Mayo medical records, Mayo Clinic medical records, to Mr. McIver, I guess the bed partner reporting activity or whatnot, but basically, did he report to his physicians at the Mayo Clinic, yeah, actually, my bed partner has told me before, I kick or I punch or I thrash about, and not the specifics or anything like that. But do you have in mind things you'd want to ask Dr. Rye about what's in the Mayo Clinic records? Or you just wanted to make sure that what's asked about the contents is carefully kept?
That's it.
Okay. All right. You comfortable with that, Ms. Clark-Palmer?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Can we get the doctor in here? Let's get the jury in here.
All jurors are present and accounted for, Judge.
Thank you, Deputy Murphy. Dr. Rye, you can work your way back to the witness stand. The rest of you can be seated. Sorry for the extension there, folks. We had some pretty important stuff that carried over from last night. We stayed after you left yesterday that we needed to wrap up, but we have done that, and we're going to continue with Dr. Rye's direct examination through Ms. Clark-Palmer.
Dr. Wright, before we leave RBD,
Yeah.
one more question about that. In Mr. McIver's records from the Mayo Clinic that you reviewed, did you see references to his bed partner complaining that he was moving his arms and legs while dreaming?
I believe so.
All right, so now, right before the lunch break, we were switching, and you were telling the jury about how we wake up from sleep. And we talked about how it's, I think you said it's not an on-off switch, but more like a dimmer switch.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I want to ask you about confusional arousals. What are confusional arousals?
So the moving in that transition from sleep to wake and, being confused, not oriented fully, maybe not remembering, and maybe performing partial behaviors that are not purposeful.
Okay, is that also some kind of sleep disorder?
Well, it's included under the subsection of parasomnia.
All right, and when do confusional arousals occur?
Well, the prototypical cases, which is sort of what we generally focus on describing the best scenarios, for example, would be early after sleep when there's a high pressure to deep sleep or stage N3 sleep, and arousals occurring. The thought is sort of now focused on that these occur out of stage N3 sleep. So, for example, sleepwalking also as a confusional arousal. Generally, that's the typical situation.
Okay, and what are some of the symptoms of confusional arousal? Well, before I get to that, are there any other kind of synonyms or terms that are used to describe a confusional arousal?
In the previous version of the International Classification of Sleep Disorders, it's listed specifically as the synonym of sleep inertia. The idea that if you sleep longer, sleep continues, or sleep drunkenness in all European language versions of sleep drunkenness, which exist.
Okay, all right, so what are some of the symptoms or characteristics that somebody would manifest during a confusional arousal?
Well, if you think about sleepwalking, maybe being an extreme example or a subgroup of that, would be getting up and performing some kind of a motor act or behavior. And if when you arouse from it is specifically and you're aware that you're doing something is variable. I mean, it can go on for quite some time, minutes as opposed to seconds. And then having amnesia, you don't have dream content. You don't remember, I was dreaming that I was doing something, because it didn't usually, arise from a dream. And these are sort of events that occur from non-dream sleep.
Okay, and when somebody is having or experiencing a confusional arousal, what can you tell us about their mental state as it relates to where they are and what they're doing?
So it's not acute and you can't really remember it. So when the brain goes into deep sleep, it essentially is shutting off stimuli from the environment. So things that we would usually respond to normally when we're awake, like we touch or we see or we hear, the brain is basically putting a brake on that, getting to your consciousness. So that's essentially what deep sleep does best. So it shuts off this area of the thalamus, which is the doorway to sort of consciousness of a sensation or the environment. So the idea is if you're startled or touched or maybe even spontaneously for reasons that you may not know, come out of a deep sleep like that, getting all these other systems back up to sort of wakefulness function when they've been in this shutdown mode to keep all the environment out, you can imagine can be misinterpreted if you're not fully conscious or awake, so to speak.
Okay. Can you give us some examples of confusional arousals?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if you look at some papers that have attempted to try to look at this across the population of people, normal people, realizing that, you know, only certain folks come to the attention of sleep doctors in our world, and try to say, well, what's the normal human experience, right? You know, broadly defined. So there has been some recent efforts to try to do that, and the frequency of these events occurring once or twice a year in people has been sort of estimated at 5 to 7% in certain age groups. So I've experienced what I would call a confusional arousal, right? I can think of classic example that would fit with the prototype. I was an intern or a resident. I come home from not sleeping and working for, I don't know, 30 hours straight when I was an intern, so I have this huge drive to sleep. My brain wants to go to deep sleep. I get home, I fall asleep immediately. My wife's out doing the laundry. This is when we lived in Chicago at the laundromat, and she came through the front door of the apartment, and I somehow was startled awake. Can I tell you what it sounded like? A ding? No. Was it a bell? No. Did she ring the doorbell? Can't remember. But I do remember, and she can tell you she remembers, me running out of the bedroom on my hands and knees and tackling her in the forehead. So that's a confusional arousal. It happened in a very typical situation, sleep deprivation, right after I had fallen asleep, probably stage 3 sleep at that age. And that was the behavior. So that's probably an extreme one, but how long did it take me to get from there to the front door and tackle her? I don't know, 15 seconds, 10 seconds? How long before I was sort of totally awake and knew what was going on? I don't know, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes? Can I tell you exactly what woke me up? What woke me up? No. So I can think of, and in fact the ICSD talks about this a lot for physicians that are on call and interns and residents. Other examples, back when we didn't have Apple phones and things, or razors, you know, landline phones and pagers. So, you know, you're asleep, you're sleep deprived, you hear some sound, and you can't immediately know wherever you're sleeping. Am I sleeping in my home bed, or actually am I in the on-call room? And do I grab the phone, or is it the beeper that went off? That would be an example of a confusional arousal. Is that person going to show up at a sleep clinic for assessment if it's sort of in this normal context? I guess if it happens 10 times a night, you do. But, and then you get classified as a disorder.
Okay.
But is it part of sort of normal human behavior? My wife, recently we were driving back from Hilton Head. She's a sleepy person. She fell asleep in the passenger in the car. I was driving, I hadn't fallen asleep, but there was something I had to swerve to miss in the road or something, and she startles awake, and she says some four-letter word, which she is not usually to do, and starts babbling about what's going on, and we're, and it takes a little while to get back to, online.
Okay,
So was that a confusional arousal? Sure.
all right.
Did I define it that way? Sure. Did I have electrodes on her head and knew she was in stage 3 sleep like I'm supposed to?
Okay.
No. Behavior.
All right. You said something about the people that come to the sleep lab or choose to come to the sleep lab. And what did you mean by that?
Well, again, it's a selection bias, right? There's all sorts of reasons some people get to clinic. How much they're interested in seeing a doctor. Lots of people don't like to see doctors. I don't like to see doctors, right? The problem isn't bad enough that I need to get it attended to. It's not interfering with my life enough that it matters. So, when we look at diseases that are classified in books, they're always the patients that come to clinic. They aren't sort of somebody random person in the population, and they,
You don't go out and stop people on the street and say, let me hook some electrodes up to your head and do a sleep study of you, do you?
well, only with their consent.
Okay. But the people who come as patients to your sleep lab,
Sure.
are they seeking you out when they're coming as patients?
Usually, or their primary care physician or some other physician specialist has recommended that they come and may gain some benefit from it, and we may find something and we may not.
Is it fair to say that there are people in the population who have experienced confusional arousals and never go to a sleep clinic?
Me. I gave you an example.
Okay. Just you or other people as well?
Calls for speculation.
How would you know if they don't go to see him,
Okay.
other than himself?
Well, we'll come back to that in
I
just a
like
minute.
your concrete.
All right, so tell us about confusional arousals. What do you look for when you're trying to determine whether someone has experienced a confusional arousal?
Yeah, so there are no protocols to measure these that are standardized. Recently at Emory, for example, we came up with the idea, and we've started to some of my colleagues, but we just don't have the information yet. Again, this is a very nascent field.
What is nascent mean?
Well, just new field.
Okay.
Of really, people would love to have a blood test or some, as we referred to previously, a biomarker, and then we wouldn't have to argue about what is or what isn't. So for example, with REM behavior disorder, we say we rarely capture a behavior, as in the case we're discussing, of a dream enactment in the sleep lab. So what can you use as a proxy? So we discussed that before lunch. And for confusional arousals, we don't have that. We don't, it's then a clinical judgment, right? We don't have a biomarker, anything on a sleep study that, says, oh, geez, you better start thinking about confusional arousals in this person. So one of the protocols we've thought about is, well, what increases the likelihood? Okay, sleep deprivation. So some people say, well, okay, we'll have the patient not sleep for a couple nights or sleep for only 3 or 4 hours, and then let's do a sleep study. Enhance the likelihood that we're going to see it. And then the other protocol some people have talked about is coming up with a standardized sensory stimulus to try to wake them up from some point in their sleep to see if they're confused. But that hasn't gone to prime time, it hasn't been standardized, nobody's agreed upon it, right? So this would be considered research.
Are there certain factors that make someone predisposed to experience a confusional arousal?
So for all the parasomnias, but particularly, for confusional arousals, there's this concept in the ICSD, essentially, is that you have a predisposition to experience it. I think not that confusional arousals and sleepwalking is a specific parasomnia, but those occur, for example, you see those a lot more in children, right? And a lot of people probably here sort of can relate to that. And then as you get older, they kind of go away. That's the natural history of much of sleepwalking. But the idea is those tend to run in families, and there may be genetic contributions to, or the predisposition to have sleepwalking. Same idea for confusional arousals, less data. Then there's the concept of priming. Is there something on top of the predisposition that makes you more likely to express a confusional arousal? And then there's the trigger.
Okay.
So predisposition, priming, and then a trigger.
All right, so let's talk about predisposition. In Mr. McIver's case, is there a factor, well, in Mr. McIver's case, when you saw him in January of this year, as part of your getting a history from him, did you talk to him about what happened on the night of September 25th, 2016?
Yeah.
Okay. And did you ask him questions about what happened when his wife Diane was shot?
Some.
Okay. And did he relate to you, did he tell you what happened on that evening?
Yeah.
Okay. And so in looking at Mr. McIver and whether he has any predisposing factors, does he, as it relates to confusional arousals?
My interpretation would be yes.
And what are those?
Well, there was the recent population-based survey that got a lot of press. It was published in a flagship journal, Neurology, trying to estimate how common these things are in the population at large, not ones in sleep clinic, how many people have these, and what might predict them or what do they associate with. It was a telephone survey. The telephone survey was sort of backed up in terms of its legitimacy by face-to-face interviews. So how accurate is a telephone survey in making a diagnosis? Obviously, the gold standard is face-to-face or a specialist. So it's about 70-75% accurate for most purposes. And so confusion, they look for things that might help predict or are associated with it. You can imagine, for example, what if it turns out we find out some common medication that everybody takes might be causing this? There might be some knowledge that might be useful to share. So in that study, they found that people more likely to be sleepy, report perceiving that they are sleepy, were more likely by several fold of experiencing a confusional arousal compared to somebody who wasn't reporting sleepiness.
Okay.
And what was clear from reading through the Mayo Clinic Jacksonville records, also personally interviewing or speaking with Mr. McIver, was this statement that still sticks in my head because other patients have said the same thing to me. I've always been somebody who likes to take a nap, end quote.
Okay.
And that was consistent from 03, 04 up to the time I saw him. And like I said, there's other people that have used that phrase, and that's why it's stuck.
Okay. The study that you were just telling us about, just give the jury an idea. Is this a study where like 5 or 10 people were interviewed?
I think it was like 19,000 or 39. It was a big number, tens of thousands of people.
And were those people all in the same geographic location?
All a random phone survey from multiple states in the United States.
All right. And did you say before that the area of confusional arousals is sort of a new area of study?
A little bit. I mean, when you look at the International Classification of Sleep Disorders 3, which is the quote most up-to-date version, there's this big emphasis on that this has to have, or arise from deep sleep. If you look back at the version 2 and say, well, what's different? They basically took sleep drunkenness and sleep inertia and sort of said, well, we're going to throw those out, and didn't really include them in the discussion of confusional arousal. Then you'd say sort of why, I wasn't there. But if you read the version 2 in between the lines, they seem to be somewhat confused, or they couldn't reconcile this idea of, well, most confusional arousals, the ones that are reported in sleep lab, early in sleep, stage 3 deep sleep, we've made that point. But how about these things that happen right when we wake up in the morning, when there's no deep sleep, that seem to share a lot similar? And they said, well, we can't explain this. We have no scientific basis. There's no clinical. Well, the simplest thing to do then is ignore it, version 3, right? Because then you don't have to deal with it.
Okay. So we've talked about the predisposing factor in Mr. McIver's case. So now let me ask you about whether there are any priming factors in Mr. McIver that you have an opinion about.
Now, these are my terms.
Okay.
And I guess other people can sort of come up with how they define what a primer is. But there was also from that same study 2 points. One is from that same study, it was more likely for somebody with a known diagnosis of a parasomnia to also experience a confusional arousal. It didn't say which parasomnia, of course, because they didn't get into that detail, but somehow these are related, possibly. That's A. And B, we can get into a long discussion of REM behavior disorder in terms of what it says about brain status and brain health, but there's a lot of data from, for example, the Parkinson's literature where people do have REM behavior disorder, that they can also have a higher frequency of sleepwalking. Not out of dreaming, out of deep sleep, or out of other stages of sleep. And in fact, it has a name. It's called parasomnia overlap disorder. So it sort of recognizes that there's a commingling of some of the distinctions between the brain not cutting off these behaviors at appropriate times is not so hard and fast.
Okay. So is it fair to say that the study, the literature, suggests that somebody with a parasomnia is more likely to experience a confusional arousal?
Yes.
All right. And RBD is a parasomnia, correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And then, so how about triggers in Mr. McIver's case?
The only 2 that are sort of listed is, this I think goes back to ICSD too, but I enjoyed the descriptive adjective of particular potency is stress and sleep deprivation. So the writers of that section, who are the experts, said stress and sleep deprivation. All I know in this instance, I don't know anything about potentially sleep deprivation. I didn't get into details of that with him. Stress, I can only say, sounds like there was some stress, at least as he perceived, and why he drew the gun out of the console. I would think that was, he must have perceived stress. I wasn't there, but he says it makes sense.
Okay. So let me ask you about what you relied upon in coming up with your opinion. In this case, you didn't go out and do any investigation of your own as to the events of September 25th, 2016.
Nothing beyond what's on the radio when I drive to work.
Well, did you go out and talk to anybody else other than Mr. McIver about what happened?
No.
Okay. When you talk about the stress and whether or not that's a trigger, you are basing that on what Mr. McIver relayed to you.
Correct.
Okay. And just to be real clear, what was it that he relayed to you that you felt could qualify as a trigger for a confusional arousal?
that they had exited an expressway onto some street somewhere. I'm not going to claim on this, it should be now after 25 years, but off of some street, did not perceive it as a safe neighborhood, and then did this. Took his gun out.
Okay. Did Mr. McIver also relate to you what happened with him after he asked for the gun? Did he relate that he continued to stay awake or something else?
No, he related to me that he fell asleep.
Okay. Is there something about the fact that he told you that he perceived danger and asked for his gun that in your opinion would mean he would not have fallen back asleep after doing that?
No.
Okay. Is it possible for somebody to experience something stressful to them and yet still fall asleep very close in time to experiencing that stress?
I'm not familiar with a tremendous amount of published scientific data on it. There's things in the lay press and just speaking with patients of mine. So we see a lot of college students who sleep too much. And one of the terms they use frequently when you take histories from them is that I've got to go take a stress nap. Got me curious as to what that was. Not a scientific term, but certainly if you Google it, you'll find it. And talking to the patients, they seem to do this because these are college students.
Well, is there anything, I guess what I'm trying to ask, maybe not very well, but is there anything medically that you know that would prevent somebody from falling back asleep after perceiving some kind of danger?
Not really.
Okay.
In a controlled fashion, I can't think of anything, or even anecdotally.
Okay. Was there something about when Mr. McIver relayed to you that he perceived a danger, asked for his gun, and then fell back asleep? Based on your medical training and your experience, is there anything that made you say, no, that couldn't have happened?
No.
Okay. Is there a based on what Mr. McIver relayed to you, is it your understanding that the gun going off occurred? Well, what is your understanding about when the gun went off in relation to when Mr. McIver said he fell back asleep? You can refresh your recollection if you need to with your report.
Yes, I do. Okay. Can I? Yeah, so after the gun came out, in terms of what he told me, that they continued to drive and negotiated changing where they were at, located, and he fell asleep at some point before they got over near wherever, I think it was near the botanical gardens or something, and next thing, remembering, this bang or feeling a bump or something. That's not my report.
But did he relay to you that it was the amount of time, maybe sort of how many minutes it was after he asked for the gun and fell back asleep and then the gun going off?
I'm not sure he said specifically, Tom. I was just sort of getting it from his description to me and the distance, and I sort of estimated 4 or 5 minutes maybe.
Okay. Is there anything about the fact that Mr. McIver would have been, or said he was asleep for that distance from when he asked for the gun, up to around the botanical gardens. Is there anything about that duration of time that means he could not have experienced a confusional arousal when the gun did go off?
I don't know why. I guess if your strict definition is you have to be in deep sleep, and that's an absolute requirement to have one of these behaviors, then it would be hard, right? Because you're not going to typically expect that to happen in an older man at that time. But I can think of lots of confusional arousals that don't occur out of deep sleep. So this sort of gets into nuances of where you draw lines for definitions of diseases and disorders.
Well, is there something, some study or a manual or something that says confusional arousals only occur when somebody is awaking from deep sleep?
They just say the word typical.
Okay.
And I think I've emphasized that previously, that that's the prototype, but it doesn't exclude it.
Okay. It doesn't exclude it, and when we talk about the prototype, is that the typical prototype for a 70-year-old man?
That's a typical prototype that I've tried to emphasize for the people that eventually get through the door at a clinic and have a sleep study. So what it is for a 72-year-old, we don't understand a lot about sleep apnea after 72, because none of the studies sample those patients. So all medical practice about sleep apnea is based on a limited data pool, based on age.
Okay.
So this isn't any different than that in terms of trying to pigeonhole things into absolute. They were careful in saying typical in the new ICSD-3. Typical doesn't exclude other possibilities.
Okay. And in the behavior that you observed in Mr. McIver when he was in the sleep lab, is there anything about that behavior that you observed in the sleep lab that informs your opinion about whether he could have been able to fall asleep in a short period of time?
I just would reiterate that he fell asleep in 2 minutes when he came to the lab and got accustomed and had all the electrodes put on him in a different environment, which I think is pretty quick. And on this nap the next afternoon, when he fell asleep in 5 minutes. Those are narcolepsy range. I mean, if you did it every time you had a nap. And this is part of this challenge of capturing things, right? Does somebody have to do it 5 naps out of 5, or does that make it any worse if you do it 4 out of 5? I mean, all of us have been probably transiently sleepy at one time where we fell asleep in a place that we didn't want to fall asleep in.
Okay.
Does that mean it's a problem that I show up in a doctor's office? At some point it probably becomes that, but it doesn't necessarily have to.
In your opinion, what Mr. McIver relayed to you about falling asleep and then being awakened when the gun went off, is that consistent or inconsistent with a confusional arousal?
I think it's one explanation, it's consistent.
Okay. And is your opinion based solely on what Mr. McIver told you?
Well, that's part of the equation. I think the other part of the equation is having a predisposition, as defined by being, always loving to take a nap. I can't remember the exact phrase, but and the data that's in the literature, having REM behavior disorder, which I think is indisputable, made by several people, that diagnosis, and as having an increased likelihood of experiencing a confusional arousal, and then a trigger. I can't speak to the trigger and what it was,
Wait, now, when you say trigger, just to be clear, you're talking about
Trigger.
the trigger on the gun or something
No, the
else?
trigger, yeah, I just realized that.
Okay,
I almost caught myself. Environmental
okay,
stimulus that may have
okay.
prompted this to happen.
If I just have one moment, Your Honor. Let me put a little more fine a point on it. Is there anything about pulling a trigger on a gun that is inconsistent with having a confusional arousal?
I don't think so.
Okay, all right, thank you, Judge.
Okay. Mr. Abate, questions for Dr. Wright? Seem to be jotting one down there.
Just a few.
Okay. Your turn.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon, Dr. Wright. How are you?
Good.
I guess I'll start with, you did a report in this case, correct? For this case?
Yes.
And has anything about your opinion that you put in your report or you submitted different today?
Not substantially, no.
When you say not substantially, I guess what has changed?
I mean, I've gained knowledge from reading more of the literature in preparation for this, so I don't think it changes my opinion.
Okay, so I guess the better question is, I guess, based on the additional things that you've read since, I guess, authoring your report, has your bottom line or your conclusions, have they changed?
No.
Okay. Now, if, correct me if I'm wrong, but your conclusions in your report were that the defendant, at the time that he shot his wife, was suffering from a confusional arousal, correct?
I interpreted that event, plus several other events he related to me, as together being consistent with confusional arousal, experiencing confusional arousal.
Okay. So your conclusion was that the defendant was suffering from a confusional arousal at the time that his wife was shot, right?
As one possible explanation, given all the other factors that put him at risk for having confusional arousals. I mean, I wasn't there, I can't say exactly what happened. It's not based on a single event, no.
Okay. I guess the better question would be, what was your determination based on all the factors that you, I guess, looked at, analyzed? What was your conclusion that the defendant was suffering when he shot his wife?
Well, he has a room behavior disorder, and he does have confusional arousal. Whether that is what happened at that point in time or not, I'm just saying it was consistent with that being an explanation.
Okay. So you said he has REM behavior disorder, correct? So is it your opinion that on the evening that he was in that vehicle and his wife was shot, based on all the information that you've reviewed, that he was suffering from REM behavior disorder or he was suffering from a confusional arousal?
Either one could explain it. I don't think REM behavior disorder is a likely explanation. But
So either one could explain it, but you don't think REM behavior disorder is the likely explanation?
all I'm saying is the features of the data I have, which is essentially what he described to me, is consistent with behaviors that may be attributed to either much more likely a confusional arousal, and as I just went through in detail, the two are probably related to one another or more likely to occur together than separately and by chance.
And let's talk about that now, as you brought that up. The article that you based that conclusion on, at least in your report, it doesn't say that if you have REM behavioral disorder, that you are more likely or the chance is greater that...
You're absolutely correct. It doesn't distinguish between different types of parasomnias, the 5 or 6, in predicting confusional arousal.
And I appreciate you anticipating the whole question, but just so the court reporter can get it, we could talk one at a time. Okay. So it's, I guess if I'm hearing you correctly, it's any parasomnia could increase your chances or likelihood of having a confusional arousal episode.
Based on that study of 20,000 some patients or subjects, not patients.
And
Yes.
those subjects or those patients, their information was obtained through like cold calls or they were doing questionnaires or surveys on the phone, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And with confusional arousals, didn't you say earlier that it's a lot of the time, or the majority of the time, you have amnesia afterwards?
You can, yeah.
And if these individuals are reporting it over the telephone and they have amnesia, how are they able to provide answers as to what they did when they were asleep or when they woke up?
Eventually people do, like I said, these can last tens of seconds before they become fully alert, and then they realize they may have, the reason they know retrospectively is because they realize that they performed a behavior that they can't exactly remember that they did. So people may find their pepper shaker in the freezer and wonder how it got there. As an example,
Well, and let's say in your instance,
or it was witnessed and somebody said something to them about it happening. I mean, I didn't perform the study, but there's all sorts of ways in the clinic that we gain that information from talking to patients. It's usually an observer, or it's usually them being able to not explain the period of time with any kind of accuracy, or that they perform, or something physically moved in space, and they can't account for why something moved or is in a different location, and they presume that they must have had, they have amnesia for it, but that doesn't mean that something didn't happen.
so is it fair to say that in a lot of these, or in this study, when the caller is relaying what occurred, it's like scientific hearsay?
I am not sure I would go that far. I think the reason that it was done and published where it was published and peer reviewed is in a journal that I was on the editorial board for some time, is that the telephone survey has been validated. It's not the only study that has used that technology. And validated means they've looked at how accurate the diagnoses are based on the questions they ask and what they get as answers versus a face-to-face gold standard clinical diagnosis by a board-certified physician. And the agreements are in the 70 to 80% range for most diagnoses, whether by a psychiatrist or neurologist or whatever, depending on the disease of interest. So there's numerous studies like that.
And I appreciate that, but I think my question was, is in that study, the way that the researchers were able to get that information was because the caller was relaying something that somebody else told them, correct?
The caller was relaying to them,
The patient.
was relaying to the caller.
The patient was relaying to the automated service or the automated system that was punching something in, something that somebody else had told them they had
Well,
done.
and either that or something that they couldn't explain and it could be part of what an observer saw, or that they realized that there was a lost period of time and they couldn't explain something. So one of those two things.
So it's a yes, and it could be other things, correct?
Yeah.
Now, I believe Ms. Clark-Palmer talked a little bit about the PSG, or the polysomnogram.
Yep.
I'm gonna call it PSG because it's the way easier to
That's
say
good.
it. But in that PSG that you did, you observed, I believe you said, there was increased or a high amount of activity in the defendant's legs.
Mostly chin. I think if I remember right, it was, so the way we quantify it, well, yeah, let me just answer it shortly. Chin greater than, as I recall, chin was top of the list, and then I think it was arms, then legs.
And if I'm remembering correctly, in the report, the PSG or your report, you referred to that as high, but in the normal range.
I referred to it until, because we don't use that as a typical, and I think I mentioned that before, it's not a standard technology, it's moving towards being codified and as a standard. 21% is clearly high, and what was in the arms and legs at the time I wrote the report, the actual interpretation of the sleep study, I didn't have the tables next to me to say, how does this compare to normals? And that's why I sort of went to the conservative side and said, high end of normal. Subsequently, I'd be happy to share, as I did in my report, I said I'd be happy to share the raw data, more specifically counted. The numbers are higher and different than controls.
But nowhere in your report did you say the numbers or what you observed was abnormal, correct?
I'll have to refer to the report.
Okay. So that refreshes your recollection. You go ahead.
So what I wrote, and here's the sentence, there was elevated phasic and tonic electromyographic activity, which means muscle twitching, in the last dream sleep period of the night. I didn't put the number 21% in there, but that's what I sort of saw. I think I may have put that in my report. And subsequently, as the summary, I said levels of activity in the anterior tibialis, which is leg, versus the arm, were at the high end of range reported in age-matched control. That was my interpretation before getting tables from the literature that were generated mostly from our work, actually, to know that should be more specific, and they are higher.
They're higher, but
than normal age-matched control.
But not abnormal. You didn't put abnormal in your report, correct?
They're higher than age-matched controls. I mean, don't know why we have to call that abnormal versus, it's different than normal people that don't have a complaint of acting out their dreams, that are the same age.
Now, can you tell the jury and all of us what's the difference between just arousal and confusional arousal?
Well, by definition, the confusional arousal includes this amnestic component, performing behaviors within or at the end of sleep that are not, that are not purposeful or semi-purposeful, with very little memory from it. I gave some examples of myself, a few others.
You did. And going back to this level, you said it's the high end of normal of his activity. How long was he asleep, Mr. McIver was asleep, before he reached those high end, before he got to that high end?
So this is, just because, and we've actually had another paper just accepted for press to sort of make this more usable to the corner sleep lab on the mall. In terms of quantification, how can we make it simpler so people can use the metric? So it is here, we just say, we have different REM periods through the night, and we said if we just sample that last one and count it by hand, because we don't have an automated way of doing it yet, to you or somebody not as familiar or interested in it, and how good is it at discriminating if we only have to have you look at that last REM period. So So the answer to your question is we looked at his last of 4 REM periods to derive that number.
What was the number though?
The number of events in 2-second microepics. So you sleep is scored, you have 30 seconds, and we say, what's the predominant state of the brain for this 30 seconds? Awake, stage 1 sleep, stage 2 sleep, stage 3 sleep, or dream. Okay. So we say, okay, that 30 seconds is dreaming. I want to see how much of that dream period has this excess of activity. So we say, well, we're not going to look at it 30 seconds and say, yes, there's some there. We have a very specific definition, 4 times amplitude background, lasting for a certain period of time. Okay, and every 2 seconds we say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And so for 2,000 of these 2-second microepics, that being the denominator, we say, well, what percent is it yes? And for the chin, it's 21%. For a person that doesn't have idiopathic REM behavior disorder, it's about 3 or 4%. Or has Parkinson's disease, it's 21%. So the numbers are much more consistent with what's seen in people with known REM behavior disorder or a disease that has REM behavior disorder, but not age-matched controls that don't. So that's the biomarker. Other people are also doing this, it's not just us.
It appeared we're having some sort of disconnect, so I apologize.
Okay.
But my question is how long did it take for him to how long was he asleep before he got to those levels? What's the number? Was it 10 minutes?
5.5 hours.
5.5 hours.
5 hours, 5.5.
So you saw this high level of activity in the chin or wherever the legs, the arms, after 5.5 hours of sleep.
Yes, it's probably in all of them. I'd have to go back and hand count them, from the first period, which occurred 60 minutes after. But as I said, we're trying to make it more usable for everybody, so we focus on that last period at 5 hours.
Okay. And it wasn't 2 minutes, correct?
No.
Wasn't 5 minutes, correct?
No.
Wasn't 15 minutes.
No.
Okay. It was 5.5 hours.
Correct.
Now, you spoke a little bit about on direct some of the factors that you use to diagnose confusional arousal. I think one of them you said was a predisposition, right?
Well, you don't use it to diagnose it. These are factors that are the construct of how to kind of think about it when you're getting a history or if you're going to make an intervention or trying to understand it.
Well, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but isn't it correct that you're using these predisposition or these factors to determine if they're suffering from confusional arousal, correct?
Using it as something in support. What we do as physicians is we take a bunch of factors typically that are in favor of a diagnosis and a bunch of factors that are not in favor of a diagnosis, and they're never usually absolute all in one corner or all in the other corner, and given the weight of evidence, we think we make a likelihood, and that likelihood will influence whether we treat or not treat, maybe the selection of treatment and all the risks that come with it.
Okay, and that was a very long answer, but my question is those factors, you use those to determine if it's a likelihood they have something or the likelihood they don't. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah.
So you use those factors to make a diagnosis or not make a diagnosis?
To help as factors to influence, based on the scientific literature, to help in supporting or negating a diagnosis.
So you use those factors coupled with the literature to make your diagnosis, correct?
And a history from the patient, and a sleep study, and...
Isn't a history of the patient part of the predisposition?
Yeah.
Okay. So a factor of whether you're predisposed or not is if you have a family history of confusional arousal or some other parasomnia, correct? And in Mr. McIver's case, was that present?
No family history.
So there was no predisposition on Mr. McIver's part.
This case is a alluded to with what you consider a predisposition versus priming. If predisposition means genetic, no, we don't have a family history, as you said.
And I guess you said priming. What are some examples of priming factors?
Well, I would consider having a disorder where there's a higher likelihood of a confusional arousal as being priming. I don't know what you would, I mean, it's all about how you define what priming means, which isn't really described very well in the ICSD-3.
Okay.
It's a construct, not an absolute.
So I guess your answer was that if they have a parasomnia like RBD, then that's a priming factor.
Yes, that's mine.
But
We could put, if you want to put it under predisposition, I guess that's your, I'm just saying it's a factor that influences the likelihood or increases the likelihood of a person experiencing a confusional arousal.
I'm not trying to put it anywhere. You're the doctor, correct? Okay, you're the expert on the sleep disorders, correct? So you consider that a priming factor, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, other types of parasomnias would include like sleepwalking, correct?
Yes.
And sleepwalking is a non-REM parasomnia.
Correct.
And is sleepwalking is it similar to, I guess, confusional arousal in the categorization of whether it's a non-REM or REM parasomnia?
Correct.
Okay. Now, with RBD, or what is RBD, or what kind of parasomnia is RBD?
REM sleep related specifically.
Yes, in order to experience a confusional arousal, or let me ask a better question. So, you're more likely to experience a confusional arousal if you're in deep sleep, correct?
That seems to be the case from what's published.
Okay, and that's the literature that you rely on when you're trying to make diagnosis coupled with other factors, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And how long, based on your years and years of experience with sleep disorders and in the sleep research area, and your knowledge of the literature, does it typically take someone to get into deep sleep?
Well, it usually happens very quickly, within tens of minutes, 20 minutes.
So,
Depends on your age. If you're a young female, 20-year-old young lady, and you're sleep deprived, you can go into deep sleep in 2 minutes. If you're a 70-year-old man where normal amounts of deep sleep are zero, maybe never, according to the fact that they may be zero. So I'm not sure where you're, it's very age and sex dependent is the answer.
how long have you been doing this?
30 years.
Okay, so in your 30 years, all of your experience, what is the typical time for someone who's not sleep deprived for them to reach deep sleep?
It varies, but like I said, age and sex is going to make a difference. It can be 20 minutes, it can be immediately, or fairly immediately. You can see it on daytime naps occasionally.
In your industry, do you average it?
Do we average the latency to deep sleep? I'm not we don't typically report it in the latency. We can look it up, we probably have it right here. I know Mr. McIver only had 2% of stage 3 sleep on the sleep study.
And how long did it take for him to get?
I can
Okay, if
give
you're
it a
looking at
look.
the reports will help, by all means.
So about 35 minutes.
So, in your study, it took 35 minutes for Mr. McIver to get to deep sleep.
That's on here, yes.
Is it on here, or is that what you found?
No, that's what we found. It's on his report.
Now, I believe you said the last, either triggering, I think you called it a trigger factor, was stress. Is that a priming factor?
Well, I think what it's listed as is stress. As I said, the ICSD-2 uses the specific words of special potency, which I thought was another way of phrasing it. Stress and sleep deprivation.
So those are priming factors, or are those triggers?
Make you more susceptible to experiencing it. I'm not going to get into grammar discussion.
And let's, for a minute, let's talk about, maybe we'll connect here, that
Okay.
personal experience. But you talked about your personal experience where you were a resident in Chicago.
Yep.
You've been up for what, 36 hours?
A lot, yeah.
Well, did you say on direct, they're about 36 hours?
I said it may have been 30 hours. Yeah, a lot of sleep deprivation.
Okay.
So again, I'm going to be primed to go right into deep sleep when I fall asleep.
And so you then tackled your wife, is that correct?
Yes.
Do you actually remember tackling your wife, or did she tell you you tackled her?
No, I did. I remember kind of becoming aware when I had my arms around her legs.
And how long did it take you to become aware that you had tackled her?
Seconds, tens of seconds.
Okay, and that's after being sleep deprived for at least 30 hours, let's say that.
Yeah.
Okay. And your conversations with Mr. McIver about, I guess, the events that led up to September 25th, did he complain about being sleep deprived?
No, didn't. I usually typically ask about that, and I don't remember putting it in my report, so if he said it, didn't strike me.
Did you ask about how much sleep he had gotten the night before?
No.
Okay. He didn't tell you he went to bed around 10 o'clock the evening before
Don't think I have that in the history, no.
and got up around 7 a.m. the next morning? How many hours of sleep is that?
Well, if you're asleep the whole time, that's 8
Okay,
or
well,
9.
so let's assume somebody's asleep the entire time. How many hours is that?
9.
Okay, 9 hours. Is 9 hours a good amount of sleep for an average, typical 70-year-old, let's say that?
A little on the long side, but you know, it's fine. You
So
know,
on the long side?
9 hours, yeah. For an older person, maybe.
I could really use 9 hours.
I mean, the field argues about what's a normal amount of sleep. In reality, we're all different.
Right. But 9 hours is a
Sure, adequate, not sleep restriction.
So based upon knowing that, and him not complaining about it, or you not putting in your report, is it fair to say that Mr. McIver wasn't sleep deprived?
Based on that knowledge, sure.
And you talked a little bit about the Jacksonville, the Mayo Clinic records,
Yes.
as well as your own
Yeah,
sleep study that you did here in Atlanta at Emory.
yeah.
In that study, or in all the studies, do they ask about, I guess, sleeping patterns?
Sleeping patterns and sleepiness, since that seems to be a target of most interventions.
And what is can you tell the jury what the Epworth sleepiness scale is?
So the Epworth sleepiness scale is a best estimate that we try to get an idea of how sleepy somebody thinks they perceive themselves to be. And it's 8 situations. So do you have a 1 to 3 chance, 0, 1, 2, 3 chance of falling asleep at a red light driving, or watching television, or in conversation. So there's 8 questions, 3 points apiece. Being the sleepiest you can be would be 24 out of 24.
Okay. And do you, in that study, or in that, I guess, is it a survey? Kind of like a survey?
Just a questionnaire.
Questionnaire. In that questionnaire, is there a question that says, as a passenger in a car for an hour without a break, how likely are you to take a nap or fall asleep?
Yes, that's in there.
And isn't it true that in 2007, when Mr. McIver took that, the ESS questionnaire,
Yep.
when he was asked, as a passenger in a car for an hour without a break, how likely are you to fall asleep, he put no chance of dozing off.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the second question that's asked, in a car while stopped for a few minutes in traffic, what is the likelihood that you'll fall asleep? And his answer was, no chance of dozing. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then again, when asked in 2009, the last time he had been, I guess, observed or had a sleep study done in Jacksonville, he was asked those same questions. And in 2009, to the question, as a passenger in a car for an hour without a break, how likely are you to fall asleep? It was a slight chance of dozing off. Do you recall that?
Not specifically, but it's fine. I don't disagree with you.
You did review the Jacksonville records, correct?
Yes.
And in that 2009 questionnaire, he was also asked in a car while stopped for a few minutes in traffic, how likely are you to doze off? And he said, no chance of dozing off. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Yes, that sounds correct.
Yes.
And in your 2000, when you did your study, this questionnaire in 2018, did you ask him the same questions?
Yes.
And when you were asked, do you recall what his answer was?
I know his Epworth score was 12.
What does that mean?
Well, it's higher. I mean, most people use 10 as a cutoff for being sleepy or not sleepy. It's kind of a bit arbitrary, but that's what most studies use. And it's a 24-point scale. And based on the recollection of the Jacksonville, I think the totals were 5 or 6. And the one done at Emory, it was a 12, which would be over 10. So maybe a little more sleepiness, certainly maybe more compared to 7 or 8 years ago. I don't recall specifically how he answered each item on there. I've got a really good memory, but not that good.
Well, does it sound familiar that he would have answered that he had an increased chance of dozing off to the first question about an hour or more of driving activity?
Wouldn't surprise me. We have to get to 12 somehow, so there's 8 questions, so that's 1.5 per if it's an equal opportunity for sleepiness.
And after, I guess, he was seen in 2009 for his sleep issues. He went almost 9 years without being seen for his sleep problems, correct?
Correct.
And you, in January of 2018, when you did your study and I guess observed him, asked him questions, got his family history, this was at least 16 months after he had shot his wife in September 2016, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So his answer, it's fair to say he had answered the questions from the ESS questionnaire multiple times, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And all of those occasions, it was either no chance or very slim chance that he would fall asleep in a car if driving for an hour.
Correct.
And if he was sitting in traffic, almost no chance he's falling asleep.
Correct.
Okay. But 16 months later, after he shot his wife, he tells you that the chance of him falling asleep while driving in a car, it's increased, right?
Correct. Correct. Compared to something 8 years ago or 9 years ago.
And after shooting his wife.
If that happened in between, which it did, yes.
Well, do you know if it happened in between or not?
Yeah, it happened in between, based on the time course.
Based on what the defendant told you, correct?
Yes.
Now, this diagnosis or this likelihood that the defendant has confusional arousal or he suffered from a confusional arousal episode, this is the first time that the defendant has been diagnosed with this, correct?
Correct.
When he was seen in 2004 through 2009 at the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, no one had ever diagnosed him with any sort of confusional arousal, correct?
Correct.
The only thing he had been diagnosed with is RBD or REM behavioral disorder, correct?
Correct.
Now, we went through this a little bit, but I want to focus on a specific area. In order to to be in a REM behavioral disorder episode, you actually have to be in REM sleep, correct?
Correct.
And how long does it typically take a person to get into REM sleep?
Again, variable by age, medication, and sex, but typically 60 to 90 minutes from sleep onset.
So about an hour to an hour and a half,
Correct.
someone would reach REM sleep.
During the night. And during the day, we don't usually see it on a nap.
And you talked a little bit about the nighttime sleep study you did with Mr. McIver.
Yeah.
How long when you were observing him and looking through all his records, did it take him to get to REM sleep?
64 minutes.
64 minutes. Okay. So over an hour.
64 minutes. 4 more than an hour.
Why do you make this difficult? 64 minutes is more than an hour, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, tell the jury a little bit about the environment that that Mr. McIver was in when you were observing him while he was doing the study. Dark?
Yeah, rooms are probably, they're kind of like a smaller sized hotel room, private with a bathroom in them, Wi-Fi, direct TV.
All the extras.
You all want to come. Not a sleep number bed though.
You may get a lot of customers after this. Okay, so it's a pretty comfortable environment.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, and he's got a pillow. He's sleeping on a bed. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, have you ever heard of? Well, you would agree with me that those that environment is not the same or consistent with the environment the defendant was in when he shot his wife.
Absolutely.
Okay, and so the study that was done was inconsistent with the environment in which this either confusional arousal or REM behavior disorder occurred in the car, correct?
Correct.
And have you ever heard of a study or it's a test? It's called maintenance of wakeful test?
Yes.
So what is that?
So, if we ask people, it's how well you can stay awake. So, so when we do the other test that I spoke about earlier, we're asking people to fall asleep, which isn't really sort of a very practical extension to what the real life scenario is, because the real life scenario is we want to see how able you are to stay awake to perform functions. And so it asks a different question and is performed differently. Similar, you have a sleep study usually, and then the next day you are put in a dark room, seated or in different situations in different labs, but the lights are turned off and you're instructed to try to stay awake. And I have no environmental stimuli, so it sort of measures your alertness level. It turns out to be much more sensitive to drug effects, for example, and it's what the FAA requires pilots who have sleep disorders to go through, because that's a more salient question. Can you stay awake to operate an airplane, not whether you can turn a light switch off and fall asleep at our request.
Okay, so we got that it's dark. Are you laying down or are you seated?
People do them either way, mostly laying down.
Okay, but they can be done seated?
Some are not seated.
Okay. And so if it's dark, you're seated, and you're trying to stay awake.
Correct.
So wouldn't that have been was that test done with Mr. McIver?
It wasn't done.
Wouldn't that have been an environment that was more like the environment he was experiencing on September 25th of 2016?
Closer than the MSLT.
Okay. And is it also closer than the PSG observation?
Yeah. I mean, there's different things you learn from different tests, so it's kind of hard to...
But that test wasn't done, correct?
Correct.
And that test is, in your words, is more consistent or like the environment he was in on September 25th of 2016.
It's more like the environment, and again, it gets to asking and potentially trying to answer a different question.
Well, I guess, let's answer my question, and if I come...
I answered your question, and I'm just...
Maybe I will ask the question you're hinting at.
Okay.
I know
breathless.
you're waiting on pins and needles, I got it. So, now, we talked a little bit about typically with a confusional arousal or when somebody's experienced it, they're in deep sleep. So, Mr. McIver, you said, explained to you, I guess, the events that occurred that he could remember, even though you're supposed to have amnesia, that he could remember about what happened when they exited off of the, I guess, expressway, correct?
A little, I didn't go into any great detail other than pretty much what I related, that they came off of the interstate, off of an exit, came to a stoplight, that I heard about, sensed danger, took the, that component.
Did he tell you, I guess, what woke him up as he got off the interstate?
I think it's a bump, I think is what I have in my recorder. It was startled awake, I'd have to look at it, referred to it specifically.
You can.
I think I have the... So it didn't say anything about a bump, it just says, he noted to me being, quote, startled awake from sleep, end quote, as he sat in the back seat of a car. But nothing about what that potential trigger may have been, or a provoking factor to keep it in the P's.
Okay, so he didn't tell you that the slight downward slope of getting off the exit is what awoke Mr. McIver?
No.
Okay. Now, did he tell you, or do you know, how long he was asleep prior to being awakened or awoke, getting off the exit?
No, I just sort of kind of calculated it based on the distances that I'm familiar with, that it must have been 3 or 4 minutes maybe.
Okay, I'm talking about before he woke up the first time. So,
No.
okay, so he didn't tell you that he was coming from Longhorns in Connors,
No.
and that it takes about between 30 and 45 minutes to get from Conyers to Atlanta. Then. He didn't tell you that?
No.
Okay. So, is he more likely to be in deep sleep after riding in a car for about 30 to 40 minutes than 2 to 3 minutes? Based on the research?
Yes, sure.
Okay. But to your knowledge and what you've been told by the defendant, he didn't have a confusional arousal when he was awoken the first time getting off the exit.
Didn't hear anything in the story other than some lack of, detail in terms of a lot of people will elaborate much further, for example.
What do you mean by that?
Well, what you did immediately after waking up, more specifics. I mean, when I spoke to him about other like events which led to the confusional arousals, he talked about taking naps on weekends frequently and being startled awake, and I tried to get to specifics about, well, what do you remember about these being startled awake when you take naps? That's what we were trying to do in the sleep lab, as opposed to the MWT, is trying to recapitulate napping, which is where the behavior arose from, so less interested in staying awake to get to that point. But also very ill-defined detail about the specifics of these startling from naps on weekends. Didn't nap at work because he didn't want to leave an impression on his colleagues and coworkers of being a nappable person. But couldn't get a lot of detail about, well, what startled you? What do you remember about being awake? Obviously, having an observer there would have been ideal.
Okay.
At those weekend games.
All right. I get that. But, so what I think I'm hearing is that when you asked him for more details about, about the nap he took on September 25th of 2016, he would pivot to the naps he'd take on the weekends.
No, it was subsequent to that. No, not side by side in sequence, serial discussion. No.
Okay. So
And you're talking, can I ask you a question?
Unfortunately, I have to ask all the questions.
Outside of here, you are free to examine them.
When I can get my sleep study, you can ask me all the questions.
I'm just trying to, you were referring to him being asleep. I didn't know if you were referring to the Conyers to exit or from the exit to the botanical gardens. It wasn't clear to me what I was responding
And
to.
I apologize. My question was, I'm referring to the nap from Conyers to Atlanta.
Okay.
And that nap was about 30 to 45
I
minutes.
didn't get any details about that. So.
Okay. And is it fair to say the only detail you got was we were getting off the expressway and I woke up?
Yeah, pretty much, you know, not much more than that.
And did he tell you what he did immediately when he woke up?
At that point, getting off the freeway.
That's correct, yes, sir.
I think he related to the fact that there was this situation and he was in a neighborhood that he thought was unsafe and he asked somebody else in the car to give him his gun.
Okay. And at that time, when he's relaying these, what he remembered of the details of when he first woke up from the first nap, Conyers to Atlanta, it's fair to say he was pretty alert when he woke up. He was able to recognize where he was, correct?
Knew where he was.
He was able to recognize, I guess, people in the area that made him not feel safe, correct?
Yes, that was his perception.
And he felt so unsafe that he had to ask or retrieve his firearm, correct? So
Yeah.
this, is that a yes? Just
Yes.
So this idea that you talked about, or the principles of sleep drunkenness and sleep inertia, this wasn't present when the defendant woke up this first time, correct?
I guess it would depend on how likely you are to pull your gun out of your console given 100 opportunities in a like situation. I mean, I guess you could interpret that potentially as being an inappropriate behavior that was inconsistent with what he would do on 99 other chances.
And I appreciate you think that's an inappropriate behavior, but my question is that from what he told you, the details of what he told you when he woke up, the fact that he immediately recognized the area he was in, he immediately recognized from his surroundings that he felt it wasn't safe. It's fair to say that he wasn't suffering from sleep drunkenness and sleep inertia, correct?
Not in their most severe forms, yeah.
Well,
People perform cognitively at different levels when they wake up.
Well,
I mean, so you know, people have looked at cognitive performance on very specified tasks right after waking up and sort of when do you get to maximum, okay? Whether you can go to Harvard. At, you know, minutes from when you first wake up, if you just do it 30 seconds. So I don't know how that translates into, you know, this specific event, because I wasn't there. I'm saying I don't think it would classify as a confusional arousal, but I classify as that it is, your brain is not functioning at 100%.
now,
Possibly.
I'm going to ask one more question and I'm just going to move on.
Okay.
So you said that there was less, I guess, the severity of the sleep drunkenness or the sleep inertia was low. But what details did the defendant tell you to make you think that there was any sleep inertia or any sleep drunkenness?
Nothing that I would traditionally associate with it unless you talk about as inappropriate as my pepper shaker is in the freezer, pulling a gun out, and it maybe is inappropriate, probably, you know, I mean, that's not me for me to judge, but would he do that if given 100 times? I don't know.
Now, you keep saying pulling the gun out. Did the defendant...
I'm sorry, asking somebody to retrieve his gun.
Now, based on, I guess, everything that we were just talking about, isn't the fact that you said there was a second nap, correct?
The second nap referring to the one over on
Yes.
the botanical gardens, correct. There was another.
Based on your, I guess, talking to the defendant and doing research, you said it took him probably between 4 and 5 minutes, based on what you know of the two locations.
Correct. He didn't give me any specifics as intimated before about the specifics related to getting off the freeway. They gave me any sense of him being asleep for that duration. I'm not sure if he was asleep, though, what he would remember from it that would allow me to estimate it was 4 minutes.
And isn't it inconsistent with, I guess, the typical confusional arousal episode that when he wakes up the second time and gun goes off, that he's alert, he knows a bullet's been discharged. Isn't that inconsistent with all of the studies?
I would say that at some point you become aware when your brain can assess the environment. I'm not sure when, between the time the shot and the sound and when he became aware of that. If it's tens of seconds, that would be fine. I don't see how that's inconsistent with a confusion arousal.
What is tens, you keep saying tens of seconds, what is
So-
the range for tens of seconds? Are we talking 10, 20, 60?
10 seconds, 15 seconds. I'll give the example again, if my phone goes off and I've got a pager and I'm on call that night, and if I turn over when the phone goes off and instead physically push the little button on the beeper to turn it off and it wasn't my pager, and then it takes me how long to realize that that is not the phone and it was the phone ringing, how long does that take? Yeah, 10 seconds. 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 12 seconds.
Now, briefly, if someone is, I guess, scared of the environment they're in, they're so scared that they ask for a weapon, when that occurs, is typically that somebody's adrenaline is up.
It's not an area that I study to know that that's necessarily the case.
Okay. After watching a scary movie, isn't it common that people can't immediately fall asleep?
Some people.
Okay.
Some people with REM behavior disorder avoid watching scary movies
Okay. But
because they know it's going to make those worse.
okay, so for those who don't avoid it, isn't it common that after somebody watches a scary movie, they have difficulty going to sleep, correct?
Some people I see, yes, some people no. I mean, it's not something I study,
So,
say with confidence.
okay.
I don't have any problems falling asleep after watching scary movies. That's the question.
There's a data point.
You are a tough guy, so, so,
My daughter, she has a hard time. My other daughter doesn't. So human behavior is human behavior.
got it. So, speaking about human behavior, is it common that somebody who's so scared that they have to retrieve their weapon, they tell the Atlanta Police Department that they're in an area that as they take every turn it gets darker and darker and the hairs on their neck are standing up, that they just fall asleep 45 minutes later? Is that common or typical?
I wouldn't think it's typical. It's an area outside of my specialty. I brought up the literature related, not literature, but the sort of the stress nap component issue that there's not really good science on, so it's hard to comment with any confidence.
And you referenced a stress nap for college students. Is it likely, based on your research, the stress nap is because they just stayed up all night studying for midterms or final exam?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And we haven't studied it. That's just my seeing patients in clinic and asking them what their experiences are.
And tell me a little bit about how alcohol affects someone's ability to enter into REM sleep.
So most agents, including alcohol, suppress REM sleep, so it would delay the onset of dreaming, typically.
So I believe you said earlier, for someone who's not drinking, it takes between 60 and 90 minutes to get to REM sleep, correct?
Correct.
So if you've been drinking, that delays it even further. It could be more than 90 minutes, correct?
Yep, could be.
Could be 3 hours, correct?
Could be.
And the fact that someone had been drinking alcohol and had only been sleeping for 4 to 5 minutes, that would make it less likely that they're suffering from REM behavior, or that they would get to REM sleep, correct?
That's what your, yes, I mean, that would be your assumption.
So in that instance, it would be very unlikely that somebody would be suffering from REM behavioral disorder, correct?
Correct.
Now, quickly, in your sleep study, you said that Mr. McIver was being videotaped, right?
Correct.
And you had an opportunity to, I guess, review the videotape of the sleep study.
Yeah.
During that video, did Mr. McIver have his arms flailing or his legs flailing like you described that some people have during a REM behavioral disorder episode?
We did not see that on his sleep study.
And during, I guess, that sleep study, did you see him make any motion with his finger like pulling a trigger?
Not that I was looking for it, specifically looking at that. There are some episodes on there where, as again, I've mentioned the distal flexors, which include this action, that's flexion. He's in a sort of pose like a sword pose, laying on his right side, and you can see some twitching in the hand, but I can't determine that that's pathologic or has any meaning necessarily, but it's on the video. We don't usually comment on that because it's within the range of what's considered normal.
And typically somebody who suffers from a REM behavioral disorder episode, they're able to at least describe, I guess, their dream, right?
No, about half patients do not give details about their dream. If it typically the ones that run spontaneously and they wake up, as opposed to your wife or some other bed partner waking you up right while you're doing these behaviors, then those are recalled. Some people can. It's about 60-40.
And in the review of, I guess, the Jacksonville Mayo Clinic records, do you recall Mr. McIver describing his dreams that he had during a REM behavioral disorder episode?
There is one recurrent one that's present in both that recollection and the one he said to me, and I don't think that I can't remember if that was associated with a REM behavior episode per se,
And
as opposed to a recurrent dream.
in your discussions with Mr. McIver after he woke up, or when he was describing what, after waking up from the second nap, the nap from getting off the expressway to around the Botanical Gardens, as he told you, was he able to describe any sort of dream he was having?
No.
And you can't be having a RBD episode and a confusional arousal episode at the same time, correct?
Not by definition.
Okay. And that's because to have an RBD episode, you have to be in REM sleep, correct?
Correct.
And confusional arousal is a non-REM sleep disorder, correct?
As defined it is, I said it's changed since the second edition to the third edition.
The 4 to 5 minutes that Mr. McIver fell asleep, your expertise and everything that you have reviewed, was Mr. McIver suffering from a RBD episode or a confusional arousal episode? Or you don't know?
I can't say with 100% confidence versus other alternatives, no. I mean, just saying that what I had said previously is the confusional arousal is consistent with his clinical situation and the knowledge I have of the event, or lack of knowledge with respect to his being more specific memory-wise.
And this being the first time that Mr. McIver had ever been diagnosed with a confusional arousal episode, correct?
The first time he's been diagnosed by anybody, or correct?
And this diagnosis occurred after he shot his wife, correct?
Yeah.
No further questions.
Do you all want a break now before redirect, or would you like to complete this witness before the break? I'm getting the completion motion from the jurors. All right, completion. So, Ms. Clark,
Yes.
if you would conduct any redirect you have of Dr. Rye.
Yes, thank you, Judge. Let me first ask you about the Epworth sleepiness scale that Mr. Abati was asking you about.
Sure.
The Epworth sleepiness scale, is that derived from a questionnaire
Yeah,
that's given to patients at a sleep clinic?
fairly standard, yeah.
Is it the only tool that you use to measure whether someone is excessively sleepy?
No.
And in this case, in Mr. McIver's case, is there other data you have that has any bearing on whether he appears to be sleepy?
I would go back to the point that he fell asleep in 2 minutes upon coming into that I think, I can't give you specific numbers about how that compares to 1,000 other people in our lab, but it strikes me that falling asleep in 2 minutes is awfully quick. And then during a daytime nap, at that specific time, which was his 4th nap, that he went directly into a dream, is just highly, it's not typical at all. I think it speaks to me that the brain is doing this for some reason, and we try to figure out what it is and what the mechanisms is, and if it's interfering with a person's quality of life, we try to help them.
And in addition to the Epworth, the questionnaire that Mr. McIver filled out, and in addition to what you saw about how quickly he could fall asleep, was there anything in what he related to you about naps that struck you as whether or not he was sleepy?
Well, he accurately assessed that he was sleeping when he was and awake when he, 3 of the naps he didn't nap. He never fell asleep, and he accurately said, because we can see people that cannot accurately perceive the state of their brain. I know it's hard to believe, but people that are physically, behaviorally, physiologically, their brain's asleep, and you wake them up and you say, were you asleep? And they say no. I mean, that happens, right? I mean, misperception of state is a real thing. But he accurately assessed the 2 naps that he slept and the 3 that he was awake.
And did he express to you any sort of preference about taking naps?
He said he liked to take naps. That struck me because I've heard it from other people, and he didn't like to do it at work because it would set a bad example to his co-workers or employees, and that he would tend to nap more on weekends.
And was that also mentioned in the Mayo Clinic records as well?
Yes.
Okay. In talking about confusional arousals,
So, can I just add something?
Yes.
Because it gets to your perception issue, just I was double checking, because we ask patients when they have these naps, not only do you perceive that you sleep, do you perceive that you dreamt on that nap? So as we have spoken about his 4th nap, he went into a dream. He correctly said, I slept. He did not identify dream imagery in that nap, even though the physiology of the brain tells you he was dreaming.
okay. Confusional arousals, Mr. Abati was asking you questions about deep sleep, and you told us, he was asking you how long it typically takes someone to get to deep sleep. And is it hard to answer the question of how long somebody typically takes to get to deep sleep?
I think a lot of these questions are hard. That's why we're spending so much time.
But that particular question.
Yeah, it is, because I emphasize for men over 50 to 60 years old, having no deep sleep is considered normal.
Okay.
So they may never have deep sleep. Does that mean then that you can't have confusional arousals because by definition they only occur from stage 3 sleep? No. You mean people have confusional arousals all the time that are older than 60 and 70.
Okay.
It's not like a prerequisite, although the way you would read the criteria, it seems to be the way they want to move.
So if something is typically noted, does that mean it always happens
No.
that way? Okay.
I hate adjectives.
And adverbs.
Mark Twain only talked about adjectives.
Being startled awake by something, is that, do confusional arousals involve being startled awake by some kind of outside, or some kind of stimulus, let me just say that.
Most of the time, there's an identifiable stimulus, but the patient that experiences it may not know what it is or can't describe it in detail. I use myself as an example. I can't remember specific qualities, and if you think about the fact that your thalamus doesn't allow sensory processing in a normal wakeful condition, I can say it was a sound, but I can't tell you much more than it was a sound would not be unusual.
Is an example of something that could startle someone awake and cause a confusional arousal being spoken to in a loud voice while you're asleep?
I'm gonna object.
Good answer, yeah.
I didn't.
Good. Great work.
Be smart.
I'm well trained. I'm trainable.
Clearly has gone through this process before. Overruled. Do you remember the question?
The question is, could a loud voice be something? And I would say, sure. I mean, anything loud. Loud voice, a loud bang, a loud bell, a beeper,
Okay.
telephone, page I rip.
How about somebody saying, "Wake up or you won't sleep tonight"?
That one might work.
Okay.
As I said, we're trying to make this more quantifiable in the sleep lab so you can bring sense to these instead of being qualitative. So a tone and a bell of certain decibels and do it in the laboratory under control. We're just not there yet as a field.
Mr. Abati was asking you about, Mr. McIver relating that he perceived some kind of danger and asking for his gun and then relaying that he then fell asleep. In your opinion, based on your experience and your education, is there anything about the fact that Mr. McIver may have perceived danger and asked for his gun that would have prevented him from then falling asleep quickly?
Well, how does that?
Ask and answer.
I'll allow it.
You all have a question?
Yes, the question, so now you may answer.
I don't see why that necessarily would. It would seem to me maybe more like, nobody's tested these situations in every scenario, so I've seen people fall asleep in all sorts of what you might think are unusual environmental situations where you otherwise wouldn't think they'd fall asleep.
But is there anything in your experience or the medical literature, your education that tells you he couldn't have
No.
fallen back asleep?
None.
All right. And the fact that he may have only fallen back asleep for some minutes, not 30 minutes, not 40 minutes, some shorter period of time, does that rule out the possibility of a confusional arousal?
No.
Okay. And Mr. Abati was asking you about, what your opinion was in this case and whether your opinion was that Mr. McIver had a confusional arousal. Do you remember those questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there a way to go back and objectively say, with your sleep studies and your knowledge and your equipment that you have, and say, okay, I can tell you what Mr. McIver's brain was thinking or doing on September 25th, 2016?
It's the holy grail, right? So no.
Okay. Is that why you were saying that your opinion is what he relayed to you was consistent with a confusional arousal?
Correct. And consistent with other aspects of his history and run behavior disorder, which I interpret the literature to say in my experience that you have a higher likelihood of having or experiencing a confusional arousal. Doesn't mean that's what happened. It just means your likelihood or chance or risk is higher.
It's one explanation for what could have happened.
Yeah, relating.
Is it, and may I rephrase?
Well, you can't ask that one, so you have to ask a different one.
Is it an explanation for what could have happened? One explanation for what could have happened that evening?
Yeah.
In the study that you were referring to, the telephone study we talked about a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. What was, just to sort of orient the jury, is that the study that talked about the relationship between parasomnias and confusional arousals?
Yeah.
Okay. And that study was published, was that study published?
3 or 4 years ago, maybe.
Where was it published?
The lead author is O'Hoyan, who's at Stanford,
Okay. Stanford University?
the one in California.
Okay. And then the article about the study, did that appear in some kind of publication?
Neurology, the journal Neurology.
And what is the Journal of Neurology?
So it's the flagship journal of the essentially American Academy of Neurology.
Okay. And are you familiar with the process that an article has to go through before it gets published in that journal?
Maybe too intimately.
Why do you say that?
It's a lot of work.
Okay. So what is the process that an article goes through before it gets published? Is it being reviewed for like punctuation and grammar or something
Being
different?
reviewed for essentially how valid are the results, the methodology, is it a good methodology, is it something that could potentially be replicated if it was done again, is it properly described and conducted and controlled for confounds, things that may make the results not valid. Those are some examples, not punctuation and grammar usually.
And the journal that comes out from the American Academy of Neurology, is that something that you rely on in your research and your role?
That and other journals.
All right. And why do you rely on articles that appear in the journal?
Well, different journals have different impacts in terms of the quality, and they in fact have what are called impact factors that range from very low in impact, in other words, people don't read it or reference it very often, or very high impact. So jurors may be familiar with New England Journal of Medicine. That's a very high impact journal. That didn't occur in there. But in the rung of thousands of medical journals, this one's in probably the top 5 to 10%, not the lowest 5 to 10%. So it has a fairly high impact.
Mr. Abati also asked you some questions about, I think you were asked about some questions about how long it may take someone to become alert or not confused when they're having a confusional arousal. Is there a set time limit or
It's ill-defined. If you look at the ICSD-2, they talk about tens of seconds. All of a sudden, ICSD-3, there's no time listed. So these are the kind of quantifying things that we just as a field need to do. So
Still in process.
So there is no, well, is there any sort of minimum amount of time it takes someone to become alert after having a confusional arousal?
I don't think it's been well defined.
Okay. I think those are all my questions, Judge.
Jurors.
May I go there?
Okay. Why don't we do this? If you would hand your cards in to the left and down, we'll take our break now. And during the break, we'll process the questions so we'll know when we come back what I'll be talking to Dr. Rai about. So once you get all the cards, get them to me. And we'll see you guys in about, I was going to say about 10 minutes. We'll see you soon. Don't talk about the case during the break.
No diagnosis.
And my daughter. So, we'll see you in a little bit. Thank you for your patience.
All rise for the jury.
Let me just number these and look at them. You all can look at them during the break.
Please be seated.
And at the end of the break, we'll talk about what to do. Okay. So Dr. Wright, excuse me, you're welcome to step down from the stand, and someone from the defense team will find you as long as you're nearby in about 10 minutes or so. Thank you. All right.
You'll come here.